Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to gently ask one small thing. If you truly enjoy these calm historical stories I make, it would mean a lot if you left a like, and perhaps shared where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It helps others discover these peaceful journeys, and I'm always humbled to see how far they travel across the world. Thank you, only if it feels right for you. And so, we begin. Somewhere in the marble halls of ancient Rome, where power and philosophy intertwined like vines around pillars, there lived a man who navigated the treacherous waters between wisdom and wealth, between moral teaching and political reality, between the life of contemplation and the demands of empire. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and though history remembers him as one of Rome's greatest Stoic philosophers, his life was far more complex than the serene teachings he left behind might suggest. Tonight, we walk beside him through the forums of Rome, and the palaces of emperors, through years of exile on rocky shores and seasons of wealth in marble villas, through the quiet hours of writing and the dangerous moments of political intrigue. His story is not one of simple virtue triumphant, but of a human being struggling to live according to his principles in a world that constantly tested them, often finding himself falling short, yet persisting in the effort to understand what it means to live well. Let the noise of our modern world fade now. Let this story carry you gently backward through time to an empire at the height of its power, where philosophers advised emperors, where fortune could elevate or destroy with equal swiftness, and where one man's words about how to face adversity would echo through 20 centuries, speaking still to anyone who has ever struggled to maintain their integrity in difficult circumstances. In the warm, sunlit province of Hispania Baetica, in the thriving city of Cordoba, where the Guadalquivir river flows broad and gentle, a child was born sometime around 4 BCE. The exact date has been lost to time, softened by the passage of centuries. But what matters is not the precise moment, but the life that followed. A life that would bridge philosophy and politics, wisdom and wealth, in ways both inspiring and troubling. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, born into a family of considerable standing and education. His father, Seneca the Elder, was a respected teacher of rhetoric, a man who trained young Romans in the art of persuasive speaking, and who wrote extensively on the subject. The elder Seneca had moved from Spain to Rome, seeking opportunity in the great capital, and had established himself as an authority on oratory and debate. Young Seneca grew up surrounded by words, by arguments carefully constructed and skillfully delivered, by the analysis of speech and the power of language. His father's house was a gathering place for educated men who discussed literature and history, who debated points of law and philosophy, who understood that in Rome the ability to speak well could open doors that birth alone might not. But there was fragility in young Seneca from the beginning. He suffered from poor health, chronic respiratory problems that would plague him throughout his life, perhaps asthma or some other condition that made breathing difficult and left him weak and sometimes bedridden. This physical vulnerability shaped him in ways that robust health never could. It taught him early about the unpredictability of the body, about suffering that comes regardless of status or wealth, about the need to find strength in something other than physical prowess. His mother, Helvia, was a woman of intelligence and character, though custom prevented her from the formal education that her sons received. Seneca would later write to her with deep affection and respect, acknowledging her influence on his development, her quiet strength, her ability to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances. From her, perhaps, he learned something about resilience, about enduring hardship with grace. The family moved to Rome when Seneca was still young, and it was here, in the bustling capital of the empire, that his formal education began. Rome in the early 1st century CE was a city of contrasts, magnificent public buildings and squalid slums, tremendous wealth and grinding poverty, high culture and brutal entertainments. It was the center of the known world, where roads led from every corner of the empire, bringing goods and ideas, slaves and free men, luxury and desperation. Seneca studied rhetoric, as was expected of a young man of his class. He learned to construct arguments, to speak persuasively, to analyze texts and build cases. But more than this, he was drawn to philosophy, particularly to Stoicism, the philosophical school that taught that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances were neither inherently good nor bad, and that the wise person maintained equanimity regardless of fortune or misfortune. His teachers in Stoicism included some of the school's most respected practitioners. He studied under Attalus, who taught him about the simplicity of true philosophy, about distinguishing between needs and wants, about the value of self-examination. He learned from Sotion, who introduced him to Pythagorean ideas about vegetarianism and the kinship of all living things. These teachers showed him that philosophy was not merely academic study, but a way of life, a set of practices for becoming better, wiser, more resilient. Young Seneca embraced these teachings with the enthusiasm of a convert. He adopted a simple diet, slept on hard beds, practiced voluntary discomfort to train himself not to depend on luxury. His father, the practical teacher of rhetoric, watched this philosophical fervor with some concern. Philosophy was all well and good, but taken to extremes, it might mark his son as eccentric. Might close doors rather than open them. The elder Seneca urged moderation, a balance between philosophical conviction and social practicality. But Seneca's health continued to trouble him. The chronic respiratory condition worsened at times, leaving him gasping for breath, confined to his room, facing the possibility of death while still young. These brushes with mortality were not abstract philosophical problems, but immediate physical realities. He learned what it meant to struggle for each breath, to face the night uncertain whether morning would come, to understand viscerally that life is precarious and temporary. These experiences shaped his philosophy profoundly. When he later wrote about death, about accepting mortality, about not fearing the inevitable end, he wrote not as someone speculating about distant possibilities, but as someone who had repeatedly faced the edge of existence. Death was not theoretical for Seneca. It was familiar, almost an old acquaintance who visited regularly and might one day stay. His family connections and education positioned him for a career in public service. In Rome, ambitious young men from good families typically followed a cursus honorum, a course of honors, a sequence of public offices that, if navigated successfully, could lead to wealth, influence, and power. Seneca, despite his philosophical leanings and his health problems, was expected to pursue this path. He began his public career as a lawyer, using his rhetorical training to argue cases in the Roman courts. He was successful, demonstrating the skill with words that his father had cultivated and that his own studies had refined. But success in the courts brought visibility, and in the Rome of emperors, visibility was a double-edged sword. To be noticed was to be vulnerable, to attract the attention of those who held absolute power and who might see any talent or popularity as a potential threat. Emperor Tiberius, who ruled during Seneca's early adulthood, was growing increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. He had retreated to the island of Capri, ruling through subordinates and informers, seeing conspiracies everywhere, striking down those he perceived as dangerous. The Senate, once the supreme governing body of the Republic, had become a submissive assembly, afraid to speak freely, watching its members disappear into exile or death on the emperor's whim. In this atmosphere, Seneca's very eloquence became dangerous. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, that Tiberius considered executing the young Seneca because his speeches were too polished, too applauded, too capable of swaying opinion. Only Seneca's poor health saved him. Someone convinced the emperor that the young man was likely to die soon anyway, that consumption would accomplish what execution might otherwise achieve. Whether this story is true or not, it captures something essential about Seneca's life. He existed at the dangerous intersection of talent and power, of philosophical ideals and political realities. His intelligence and eloquence made him valuable, but also vulnerable. His principles taught detachment from external circumstances, but those very circumstances could destroy him regardless of his philosophical equanimity. Through these early years, Seneca was developing the philosophical voice that would later characterize his writings. He was learning to examine his own reactions, to question his desires and fears, to practice the Stoic exercises that his teachers had taught. When ill health confined him to bed, he used the time to read and think and write. When political dangers threatened, he reminded himself that death was nothing to fear, that what mattered was maintaining virtue regardless of circumstances. But he was also learning the gap between philosophical ideals and lived reality, between what Stoicism taught and how difficult it was to actually embody those teachings. He wanted to live simply, yet he moved in circles of wealth and power. He wanted to be detached from external goods, yet he pursued success in the courts and in public life. These contradictions, these tensions between principle and practice, would mark his entire life, making him not a perfect sage, but a struggling practitioner, not an embodiment of Stoic ideals, but a person trying, imperfectly, to live according to them. The Rome of his youth was transitioning between the age of Augustus, the first emperor who had transformed the Republic into an empire, and the increasingly unstable reigns that would follow. The illusion of restored republican government was wearing thin. Everyone understood that real power lay with the emperor, that the forms of the Republic, the Senate, the magistracies, the public assemblies, were theatre, important theatre perhaps, but theatre nonetheless. Seneca, educated in republican rhetoric and Stoic philosophy, had to navigate this reality. He had to serve a system he didn't entirely respect, had to accommodate himself to political realities that his philosophy told him were ultimately meaningless. This accommodation, This compromise between ideals and necessities would be the defining challenge of his life. As he entered his 30s, Seneca was establishing himself as a rising figure in Roman public life, eloquent, educated, well-connected, despite his health problems. But the most dramatic turns of his life were still to come. Exile and return, poverty and vast wealth, proximity to absolute power, and the terrible dangers that came with it. All of this awaited him. His journey was just beginning, and the path ahead would test his philosophy in ways his teachers could never have prepared him for. The evening light that fell on Rome in those years had the same quality it has always had, golden and indifferent, illuminating marble and misery with equal clarity. Under that light, a young man moved through the city's streets and forums, carrying within him philosophical principles and human ambitions, wisdom and weakness, the desire to live well, and the compromises that living required. The tensions and contradictions that marked his youth would mark his entire life, making his story not one of simple moral triumph, but something more complex and, perhaps, more human. The year 41 CE brought a catastrophic reversal of fortune that would test everything Seneca believed about Stoic resilience. The Emperor Caligula, whose madness and cruelty had terrorized Rome for 4 years, was assassinated by his own guards. In the chaos that followed, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was proclaimed emperor, a man thought to be weak and easily manipulated, a scholar who stammered and shook and seemed an unlikely ruler. But Claudius's wife, Messalina, was anything but weak. Young, beautiful, and ruthlessly ambitious, she saw threats everywhere and moved to eliminate them. Her target list included Seneca, who by now had established himself as a prominent figure in Roman society, a successful lawyer, a respected writer, a man whose eloquence and connections made him influential and therefore dangerous to those who feared competition for the emperor's favor. The accusation against Seneca was adultery with Julia Livilla, a sister of the late Emperor Caligula. Whether there was any truth to this charge remains unknown, lost in the murk of palace intrigue and political maneuvering. What mattered was that Messalina wanted Seneca removed, and in the Rome of emperors, evidence was often less important than expediency. Seneca was condemned to death, but Claudius, perhaps influenced by others, or perhaps genuinely uncertain about the evidence, commuted the sentence to exile. Instead of execution, Seneca would be banished to Corsica, a large island in the Mediterranean, rugged and remote, far from the centers of power and culture that had defined his life. For a man of Seneca's background and health, exile to Corsica was a brutal sentence. The island was undeveloped, lacking the amenities of Roman civilization. The climate was harsh, the society provincial, the intellectual stimulation non-existent. For someone accustomed to the libraries of Rome, to conversations with educated men, to the forums and theaters and baths of the capital, this isolation must have felt like a kind of death. Seneca arrived on Corsica in his early 40s, at an age when Roman men of his class expected to be advancing in their careers, accumulating wealth and influence, solidifying their positions. Instead, he found himself stripped of everything, his property confiscated, his career destroyed, his future seemingly finished. The philosophical principles he had studied and taught were now put to their ultimate test. Could Stoicism actually sustain him through this catastrophe? The early months were the hardest. despite all his philosophical training, despite years of studying how to maintain equanimity in the face of misfortune, Seneca struggled. He wrote letters pleading for recall, composed works flattering Claudius and Messalina, seeking any avenue back to Rome. These writings, which survive, are embarrassing in their obsequiousness, so at odds with the dignified wisdom of his other works that some scholars have doubted their authenticity. But they're almost certainly genuine, and they reveal something important about Seneca. He was human, subject to the same desperation and fear as anyone else facing catastrophic loss. His philosophy didn't make him immune to suffering. It gave him tools to work with that suffering, to eventually process it and find meaning in it. But the process took time, and it wasn't pretty. Gradually, over months and years, Seneca adapted to his exile. He began to practice the philosophy he had taught, to actually live the principles he had advocated. He reminded himself that external circumstances, wealth, status, homeland, were not true goods, that they were preferred indifference in Stoic terminology, things nice to have, but not essential to living well. What mattered was maintaining his virtue, his rationality, his character, regardless of where he was or what he possessed. He established a routine on the island. He read, he wrote, he observed nature. Corsica, while harsh, had a wild beauty, rugged coastlines, dense forests, mountains rising from the sea. Seneca began to notice these things, to find peace in the natural world that he might have overlooked in the busy sophistication of Rome. He wrote to his mother, Helvia, a consolation intended to comfort her in her grief over his exile. In this work, Consolation to Helvia, we see Seneca beginning to reclaim his philosophical voice, to articulate the Stoic understanding of misfortune with genuine feeling rather than mere theoretical abstraction. He tells her not to weep for him, that he isn't truly suffering because he has his mind, his studies, his ability to contemplate truth. As long as he can think and reason, he possesses everything essential. Whether he fully believed this, or whether he was trying to convince himself as much as comfort his mother, we cannot know. But the act of writing it, of articulating the philosophical perspective, seems to have helped him embody it. Words became tools for shaping his own mind, for training himself to see his situation differently. He also wrote to Polybius, a powerful freedman in Claudius's court, another consolation that doubles as a plea for assistance in gaining recall. This work is more troubling. It contains excessive flattery of Claudius and seeks patronage shamelessly. It shows Seneca at his most compromised, using his philosophical and rhetorical skills not for the pursuit of wisdom, but for the pursuit of political favor. These works from exile reveal the complexity of Seneca's character. He was genuinely committed to Stoic philosophy and genuinely trying to live according to its principles. But he was also ambitious, vain, desperate to return to Rome and to the life he had lost. For Yu, tension between these aspects of his personality, the philosopher and the politician, the sage and the social climber, runs through his entire life. During these years on Corsica, Seneca had time for deep reflection. The isolation that had seemed like punishment became an opportunity. Away from the distractions of Rome, from the social obligations and political maneuvering, he could focus on what he actually believed, what actually mattered to him. He could examine his own mind with the kind of attention that busy urban life rarely permitted. he developed the writing style that would characterize his mature works, personal, intimate, often cast as letters to friends, addressing practical moral problems rather than abstract philosophical questions. He wrote not as a distant authority proclaiming truths, but as a fellow struggler sharing what he had learned through his own difficulties. The island itself became a kind of teacher. Its isolation taught him about self-sufficiency, about finding resources within himself rather than depending on external sources. Its harshness taught him about endurance, about the body's ability to adapt to difficult conditions. Its beauty taught him about the consolations available in nature, in simple observations of the world's rhythms and patterns. 8 years passed on Corsica, 8 years of exile, of reading and writing, of struggling with despair and boredom, of practicing philosophy under conditions that tested its value. 8 years during which Seneca transformed from a successful Roman lawyer into something different, a philosopher-writer whose works would eventually reach far beyond the island that held him. In Rome, meanwhile, things were changing. Messalina, whose machinations had sent Seneca into exile, overreached herself. Her sexual scandals and political intrigues finally provoked Claudius to have her executed in 48 CE. The emperor remarried, this time to his niece Agrippina, a woman as ambitious as Messalina, but more intelligent and calculating. Agrippina had a son from a previous marriage, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would later be known to history by his adopted name, Nero. Agrippina was determined that her son would become emperor, and she began systematically removing obstacles and positioning supporters. She needed allies, particularly educated men who could serve as tutors and advisors. Someone suggested Seneca. Despite his exile, his reputation as a philosopher and writer had grown. His works circulated, were copied, were read. His name carried weight. Agrippina saw an opportunity. She used her influence with Claudius to recall Seneca from exile in 49 CE, ostensibly granting him a position as praetor, but really securing him as tutor for the young Nero. For Seneca, the recall must have felt like resurrection. After 8 years of exile, 8 years of what must have felt like death to his public and political life, he was being summoned back to Rome, back to civilization, back to relevance. But the summons came with strings attached. He would serve Agrippina's ambitions, would help prepare her son for power, would become entangled in the dangerous politics of the imperial court. As he sailed from Corsica back to Italy, back to Rome, Seneca must have experienced a complex mixture of emotions. Relief and gratitude, certainly, joy at the prospect of returning to the life he had missed, but also, perhaps, some trepidation. He was being recalled not for his own sake, but to serve others' purposes. He was stepping back into the dangerous world of imperial politics, where proximity to power could destroy as easily as elevate. The philosopher who had learned painful lessons about the instability of fortune, about the dangers of ambition, about the value of simplicity and detachment, was about to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Rome. The tensions and contradictions that had marked his earlier life would intensify rather than resolve. The gap between his philosophical teachings and his lived reality would widen even as his wisdom deepened. The ship that carried him back to Rome carried also all these unresolved questions, these internal contradictions, these compromises between principle and practice. The island faded behind him, that place of exile that had also been a place of transformation, that prison that had also been a school. Ahead lay Rome, glittering and dangerous, full of promise and threat, offering everything his philosophy told him didn't matter, and everything his human nature couldn't help but desire. Rome, when Seneca returned in 49 CE, was both familiar and changed. The physical city remained much as he remembered. The forums and temples, the Tiber flowing broad and brown through its ancient course, the 7 hills crowned with buildings public and private. But the political atmosphere had shifted, grown more tense and uncertain under Claudius's erratic rule and Agrippina's manipulations. Seneca's official position was that of praetor, a magistracy that in republican times had carried significant judicial authority, but under the empire had become more ceremonial. His real role, however, was as tutor and advisor to the 12-year-old Nero, Agrippina's son, whom she was positioning to succeed Claudius as emperor. Teaching a future emperor presented unique challenges and opportunities. Seneca approached the task with a combination of genuine pedagogical commitment and careful political calculation. He understood that Nero's education would shape not just one boy's character, but potentially the governance of the entire empire. If he could instill in Nero an appreciation for philosophy, a commitment to justice, a sense of duty toward his subjects, he might help create a philosopher king, a ruler guided by wisdom rather than caprice. The curriculum Seneca designed emphasized literature, rhetoric, and philosophy, particularly Stoic philosophy. He taught Nero to speak eloquently, to appreciate poetry and drama, to think about moral questions. He introduced him to the works of earlier Stoic teachers, to the idea that a ruler should see himself as a servant of the state rather than its master. That power was a responsibility rather than a privilege. Nero proved to be an apt student in some ways. He was intelligent, artistically inclined, capable of genuine charm and eloquence. He absorbed his lessons, performed well in his studies, showed the kind of promise that encouraged Seneca to believe that the young prince might indeed become a wise and benevolent ruler. But there were troubling signs from the beginning. Nero was also vain, self-indulgent, easily influenced by flattery, more interested in artistic pursuits and public performance than in the serious work of governance. He craved admiration and applause, wanted to be loved and celebrated, showed little interest in the unglamorous but essential tasks of administration and judgment. Seneca, as a Stoic, believed in the power of education to shape character, in the possibility of moral improvement through reason and practice. But he was also learning, through his experience with Nero, the limitations of education when it encounters a personality resistant to its deepest lessons. You can teach someone philosophy, but you cannot force them to embody it. You can provide the best instruction available, but the student must choose to truly learn. Meanwhile, Agrippina's plans moved forward. In 54 CE, Claudius died, almost certainly poisoned, though the exact circumstances were deliberately obscured. Nero, at 17, became Emperor of Rome, one of the youngest rulers the empire had known. And Seneca, as Nero's tutor and advisor, suddenly found himself at the very center of power. The early years of Nero's reign, which historians call the Quinquennium Neronis, were marked by surprisingly good governance. Seneca, working closely with Afranius Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, effectively managed the empire. They advised Nero on policy, drafted his speeches, guided his decisions, provided stability and competence in administration. Seneca wrote speeches for Nero that articulated high-minded principles of governance. The young emperor promised to rule with mercy and justice, to respect the Senate, to administer the empire for the benefit of all. These speeches expressed Seneca's own philosophical convictions about how power should be exercised, and for a while, policy seemed to align with principle. Seneca also wrote, during this period, a work called On Clemency, addressed directly to Nero. In it, he argued that clemency, mercy, the willingness to pardon rather than punish, was both the right moral stance and the most effective political strategy for a ruler. A merciful ruler earned genuine love rather than fearful obedience, created stability through goodwill rather than through terror. The work is both a genuine philosophical treatise and a piece of political persuasion, an attempt to guide Nero toward a particular kind of rulership, while also justifying and celebrating the young emperor's character. Reading it now, knowing what Nero would become, there's a painful irony to Seneca's praise and his hopes. During these years, Seneca also accumulated enormous wealth. As advisor to the emperor, as a member of the inner circle, opportunities for enrichment were abundant. Land grants, favorable business arrangements, gifts from those seeking favor. All of these flowed to Seneca. His estates expanded, his houses became palaces, his wealth grew to rival that of the richest men in Rome. This accumulation of wealth created perhaps the greatest contradiction of Seneca's life. Here was a Stoic philosopher, someone who taught that wealth was not a true good, that the wise person should be indifferent to material possessions, that simplicity and self-sufficiency were virtues. Yet here he was, living in luxury that rivaled the emperor's own, owning vast estates worked by hundreds of slaves, dining off gold plates, surrounded by artwork and furnishings of exquisite expense. Seneca was aware of this contradiction, and he addressed it in his writings. He argued that Stoicism didn't require poverty, that wealth was morally neutral, that what mattered was not how much you owned, but how you related to your possessions. A wealthy person could be a Stoic if they remained inwardly detached, if they understood that their wealth could disappear tomorrow, and that this would not diminish their essential well-being if they used their resources for good purposes. His critics, both in his own time and in ours, have found these arguments unconvincing. They sound like rationalizations, ways of justifying behavior that contradicted his teachings. How can you claim to be detached from wealth while actively accumulating it? How can you teach simplicity while living in marble halls? How can you advocate self-sufficiency while requiring the labor of hundreds to maintain your lifestyle? These questions cut to the heart of Seneca's life and legacy. He was genuinely committed to Stoic philosophy, genuinely trying to help people live better lives through his writings, genuinely wrestling with moral questions. But he was also ambitious, vain, compromised by the very political and economic systems he sometimes criticized. He was neither pure sage nor simple hypocrite, but something in between, a person trying imperfectly to live according to ideals that were perhaps impossible to fully embody in the world he inhabited. His relationship with Nero began to change as the young emperor matured and began to assert himself. The dutiful student who had listened to his tutor's lessons started to resent those lessons, to see Seneca's guidance as constraint rather than assistance. Nero wanted to indulge his artistic passions, to perform publicly as a singer and actor, to live without the moral restraints that Seneca tried to impose. In 59 CE, Nero arranged the murder of his own mother, Agrippina. The woman who had engineered his rise to power had become, in his view, an obstacle to his freedom. The killing was elaborate and bungled, a collapsing boat, assassins finishing what the sinking ship failed to accomplish. Seneca was consulted about the aftermath, about how to present the matricide to the Senate and the public. He drafted a statement for Nero claiming that Agrippina had been plotting against her son, that her death was necessary and justified. It was one of Seneca's most shameful moments, using his eloquence to cover up a mother's murder, his philosophical authority to legitimize patricide. Some sources suggest he opposed the murder in private council, but publicly he helped Nero manage its consequences. This incident marks a turning point. Seneca had always been in a compromised position, serving power while trying to guide it. But now he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He had become complicit in genuine evil, had used his gifts not to promote virtue, but to excuse vice. The gap between his philosophy and his practice had become a chasm. Over the following years, Nero became increasingly erratic and cruel. He executed senators on flimsy pretexts, pursued his artistic ambitions obsessively, spent vast sums on personal indulgences, ruled more through furor than through the clemency Seneca had advocated. The quinquennium Neronis, those good early years, seemed like a distant dream. Seneca tried to withdraw, to reduce his involvement, to step back from the center of power. He offered to return his wealth to Nero, to retire from public life, to end his service. But Nero, perhaps sensing that Seneca's retirement would be seen as a rebuke, refused. The philosopher was trapped, unable to leave, unable to effectively influence, watching the deterioration he couldn't prevent. His health, never robust, worsened with age and stress. The respiratory problems that had plagued him since youth intensified. He suffered from other ailments as well, possibly heart problems or other conditions. He was in his 60s now, an old man by Roman standards, tired, disillusioned, watching his hopes for guiding Nero toward philosophical rulership crumble into ruins. Yet even during these difficult years, Seneca continued writing. His letters to his friend Lucilius, which would become his most famous work, began during this period. In them, he retreated from politics and returned to philosophy, writing about how to face death, how to manage anger, how to find peace in the midst of chaos. These letters, written by a man entangled in the imperial court, offered wisdom about detachment and tranquility. The contradiction remained, perhaps starker than ever. Seneca, the wealthy courtier, and Seneca, the Stoic sage, coexisted uneasily, each calling the other into question, each real in its own way. He had achieved everything the world offered: wealth, fame, influence, literary success, and he had found it all unsatisfying, exactly as his philosophy predicted. But he had also compromised his principles repeatedly to obtain and maintain those very things. As the 60s CE progressed, Seneca must have sensed that his time was running short, that Nero's increasingly paranoid and violent reign would eventually turn against him. The emperor who had once been his student was now his danger. The power he had helped create now threatened to destroy him. The wheel of fortune, which Seneca had written about so often as something external and ultimately meaningless, was turning again, preparing to complete its revolution. By the year 62 CE, Seneca's position had become untenable. Afranius Burrus, his ally in guiding Nero, died, possibly of natural causes, though poison was suspected. Without Burrus's military authority to balance his philosophical influence, Seneca's power in the court diminished rapidly. Nero appointed new advisors, men less committed to restraint and good governance, more willing to indulge the emperor's whims and cruelties. Seneca made another attempt to withdraw from public life, to retire with dignity while that was still possible. He approached Nero with a carefully crafted speech, offering to return all the wealth the emperor had bestowed upon him, to withdraw from court, to spend his remaining years in quiet philosophical study. It was a reasonable request, a way for both men to preserve face while severing their increasingly strained relationship. But Nero refused again, this time with an edge of menace beneath the friendly words. He couldn't afford to have his former tutor withdraw in apparent disgust at his rule. He needed Seneca visible and associated with his regime, even if Seneca no longer wielded real influence. To let him retire would be to admit that something had gone wrong, that the philosophical emperor Seneca had tried to create had failed to materialize. So Seneca remained, but he withdrew as much as possible within the constraints of remaining. He spent less time at court, more time at his various estates. He devoted himself to writing, producing some of his most important works during these years: letters, essays, dialogues exploring ethical questions with depth and nuance, born of long experience and hard-won wisdom. The letters to Lucilius, which form the bulk of his surviving correspondence, show Seneca at his most philosophically mature and his most personally vulnerable. He writes about aging, about illness, about the fear of death and how to overcome it. He writes about friendship, about the value of having someone with whom you can be completely honest. He writes about practical ethics, how to deal with anger, how to use time well, how to face misfortune. These letters feel different from his earlier works. There's less rhetorical flourish, more directness and intimacy. Seneca is writing not to impress, but to teach, not to display his eloquence, but to work through problems that genuinely trouble him. He is thinking on paper, examining his own mind and life, trying to reconcile his philosophical principles with his lived experience. He returns again and again to the question of how a Stoic should regard wealth. His answer is sophisticated, but perhaps not entirely convincing. He argues that wealth is a test, an opportunity to practice philosophical principles. The wealthy person must maintain inner freedom while surrounded by luxuries, must remain detached while possessing much, must understand that everything could be lost tomorrow, and that this wouldn't diminish their essential worth. But he also acknowledges the dangers of wealth, how it creates obligations and vulnerabilities, how it entangles a person in systems and relationships that constrain freedom. He admits that poverty might be easier philosophically, that having less makes it simpler to practice detachment. Yet he doesn't actually embrace poverty. doesn't divest himself of his estates and possessions. The tension remains unresolved. In Rome, Nero's reign had descended into open tyranny. The Great Fire of 64 CE destroyed much of the city, and Nero used the disaster as a pretext for persecution. Christians, a small and obscure sect at this time, were blamed and subjected to horrific executions, burned alive, torn apart by dogs, crucified as public spectacles. Seneca was not directly involved in this persecution, but nor did he speak out against it. The philosopher who had written so eloquently about mercy watched silently as innocents suffered. There were also plots against Nero, conspiracy theories real and imagined. In such an atmosphere, anyone could become suspect. Anyone could be denounced or accused. Seneca's very prominence made him vulnerable. His wealth made him a tempting target for confiscation. His philosophical writings, with their emphasis on virtue and freedom, could be read as implicit criticism of tyrannical rule. In 65 CE, a genuine conspiracy was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, who was to replace Nero as emperor. The plot involved numerous senators and knights, perhaps as many as 40 conspirators. They planned to assassinate Nero during a public festival and install Piso in his place. But someone betrayed the plot, and Nero moved swiftly to crush it. Whether Seneca was actually involved in the conspiracy remains unclear. The evidence is ambiguous, potentially fabricated or extracted through torture. Some sources suggest he knew about the plot, but didn't report it. Others claim he was completely innocent, that his inclusion in the accusations was simply Nero's way of finally ridding himself of his former tutor. What is clear is that Nero used the conspiracy as an excuse to order Seneca's death. A tribune was sent to Seneca's villa with the command that he commit suicide. This was the customary Roman approach to dealing with aristocratic offenders, allowing them to die by their own hand rather than suffering public execution, preserving some dignity for themselves and their families. Seneca received the order calmly, or so the accounts tell us. This was the moment his entire philosophical life had prepared him for, the ultimate test of whether his Stoicism was merely theoretical or genuinely embodied. He had written extensively about death, about how the wise person faces it without fear, how dying well is the final act of a life well lived. Now he would discover whether he could actually practice what he had taught. He was with his wife, Paulina, when the tribune arrived. Upon hearing the order, Paulina declared she would die with him. Seneca, in the accounts that survive, tried to dissuade her, arguing that she should continue living. But she insisted, and they decided to open their veins together, the standard method of Roman suicide. The scene that followed, as described by the historian Tacitus, has an almost theatrical quality. Seneca's veins were cut, but because he was old and thin and his blood flow was sluggish, death came slowly. He also drank poison, hemlock like Socrates, but this too failed to work quickly. Finally, he was placed in a hot bath to encourage bleeding, and there he finally died, probably from a combination of blood loss and asphyxiation from the steam. Throughout this ordeal, which may have lasted hours, Seneca reportedly maintained his philosophical composure. He conversed with friends who were present, dictated final thoughts to scribes, encouraged them to remember his philosophical teachings and to live according to them. Whether these accounts are accurate or embellished, They represent how Seneca wanted to be remembered, as someone who faced death as philosophy taught one should, with courage and calm acceptance. Paulina survived. Nero, hearing of her attempt to die with her husband, ordered that she be saved. Her arms were bound, her bleeding stopped, and she was compelled to continue living. She survived for several more years, pale from blood loss, a living reminder of that day. Seneca's death in April of 65 CE came when he was around 68 years old. He had lived through the reigns of 4 emperors, had experienced exile and wealth, philosophical obscurity and political prominence, had written works that would influence Western thought for 2 millennia, and had struggled throughout to reconcile his philosophical ideals with the messy realities of human life. His final moments, whatever their exact details, represented an attempt to achieve in death what had eluded him in life: perfect alignment between principle and practice, between what he taught and what he did. And perhaps he succeeded, perhaps at the very end, facing the inevitable, with calm and courage, he demonstrated the value of the philosophy he had spent his life studying and teaching. The news of his death spread through Rome, met with various reactions. Some mourned the loss of a great philosopher and writer. Others saw it as justice for a hypocrite who had preached poverty while living in luxury, who had taught virtue while serving tyranny. Still others saw it simply as another casualty of Nero's paranoia, another life snuffed out by a regime grown mad with power. Nero himself continued his reign for a few more years, growing increasingly unstable and cruel, until finally, in 68 CE, facing multiple rebellions and abandoned by his guards, he too committed suicide. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with him, and Rome descended into a year of civil war before stability was restored under a new dynasty. But Seneca's words survived. His letters and essays were copied and preserved, read and studied, passed down through the centuries. The contradictions of his life didn't prevent his teachings from resonating with later generations. Perhaps, in fact, those very contradictions, the gap between his ideals and his reality, made him more rather than less valuable as a teacher. He showed not how to be perfect, but how to continue striving for wisdom even when falling short, how to practice philosophy even in compromise, how to find meaning in the effort itself even when the achievement remains incomplete. The villa where he died eventually fell to ruins. The estates he owned passed to other hands. The vast wealth he had accumulated dispersed into other coffers. But the questions he wrestled with, how to live well, how to face death, how to maintain integrity in corrupt systems, how to reconcile philosophy with reality, these remained as vital and challenging as ever, waiting for each new generation to grapple with them anew. To truly understand Seneca's enduring impact, we must turn to his writings, particularly the letters to Lucilius, which represent his most mature philosophical work and his most intimate voice. These 124 letters, written during the last years of his life, form a kind of philosophical autobiography, a record of one man's attempt to live according to Stoic principles while navigating the complexities and compromises of actual existence. The letters are ostensibly addressed to Lucilius Jr., a friend who was serving as procurator of Sicily, a middle-ranking administrative position in the imperial government. Whether Lucilius was a real person or a literary device remains debated. But the letters themselves are undeniably real, genuine explorations of moral and practical questions, written with the directness and urgency of someone who knows time is running short. What makes these letters remarkable is their tone. Seneca doesn't write as a distant sage dispensing wisdom from a position of perfect virtue. He writes as a fellow traveler on the philosophical path, someone still learning, still struggling, still discovering truths through experience. "I'm not teaching you," he writes early in the correspondence. "I'm learning alongside you." The letters cover an extraordinary range of topics, but certain themes recur: death, time, wealth, friendship, virtue, and the challenge of living according to one's principles. Seneca returns to these themes again and again, approaching them from different angles, revealing through the repetition not monotony, but genuine preoccupation, the mind circling around problems that resist easy resolution. On death, Seneca is both philosophically sophisticated and psychologically acute. He acknowledges that despite all philosophical training, the prospect of non-existence can still provoke fear. He doesn't dismiss this fear as irrational or weak, but works through it patiently, using arguments and analogies, thought experiments and historical examples. "We should rehearse death," he writes, meaning we should contemplate our mortality regularly, not morbidly, but as a way of appreciating life and reducing death's power to terrify. "Every day we live, we are dying. Every breath brings us closer to the end. Understanding this shouldn't make us depressed, but rather focused, appreciative of the present moment, less likely to waste time on trivialities." He points out that we've already experienced something very like death, the infinite time before we were born. We didn't suffer then. Why should we fear returning to that state? Death is natural, inevitable, universal. Emperors and slaves, philosophers and fools all face the same end. Fearing it is like fearing the setting of the sun, a rebellion against nature itself. Yet Seneca also writes with genuine emotion about the death of friends, about loss and grief. He doesn't claim to be beyond these feelings. Instead, he distinguishes between natural grief and excessive mourning, between honoring the dead and being destroyed by loss. We can feel sadness without drowning in it, can acknowledge pain without letting it rule us. On time, Seneca is passionate almost to the point of anger. "We waste our most precious resource," he argues, "the one thing we can never recover. Witi hupu complain about life being short, but it's not short. We make it short by squandering it on pointless activities, on pleasures that don't satisfy, on pleasing people we don't respect, on accumulating things we don't need. It's not that we have a short time to live," he writes, "but that we waste a lot of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements if it were all well invested. The problem isn't the amount of time we're given, but how we use it." He criticizes people who live as if they'll live forever, who postpone important things until later, who spend their present moment in service to an imagined future that may never arrive. The wise person, Seneca argues, lives as if each day might be their last, not in reckless indulgence, but in focused attention to what matters, in immediate presence to life as it's actually happening. On wealth, the topic where his life and teaching seem most contradictory, Seneca is thoughtful, but perhaps not entirely convincing. He argues repeatedly that wealth is not inherently bad, that poverty is not inherently virtuous, that what matters is one's relationship to possessions rather than their presence or absence. The wealthy person can be a philosopher if they maintain inner freedom, if they're prepared to lose everything tomorrow, if they use their resources well and don't become enslaved by them. The poor person can be a philosopher too, perhaps more easily, since they have less to manage and less to lose. But virtue doesn't depend on economic status. It depends on character and understanding. He uses himself as an example, claiming that despite his wealth, he remains inwardly free, that he owns his possessions rather than being owned by them. But even as he makes these arguments, one senses the defensiveness, the awareness that critics see hypocrisy. He protests perhaps too much, suggesting that the accusation stings precisely because it contains some truth. On friendship, Seneca is warm and insightful. True friendship, he argues, is based on shared virtue rather than shared interests, on mutual improvement rather than mutual indulgence. A real friend is someone who makes you better, who challenges you to live up to your principles, who loves you not for what you can provide, but for who you are. He distinguishes between the crowd of associates and the one or two true friends. Most people we know superficially, maintain connections with for practical reasons, share pleasant times with, but never reveal our real selves to. But a true friend is someone to whom you can speak with complete honesty, someone who knows your faults and loves you anyway, someone whose presence makes you want to be better. The relationship with Lucilius, as Seneca presents it in the letters, exemplifies this ideal. They share their philosophical progress, their struggles with temptation, their fears and hopes. They encourage each other, challenge each other, serve as mirrors in which each can see himself more clearly. On virtue, the central concept of Stoic philosophy, Seneca is both orthodox and original. Following standard Stoic doctrine, he insists that virtue is the only true good, that everything else is at best neutral, neither good nor bad in itself. Health, wealth, fame, pleasure, these are preferred indifferents, nice to have, but not essential to happiness or to living well. But Seneca also recognizes that actually believing this, truly embodying this understanding, is incredibly difficult. We know intellectually that externals don't matter, but we react emotionally as if they do. We understand theoretically that death is natural, but we fear it anyway. The work of philosophy is closing this gap between intellectual assent and emotional conviction. He offers practical exercises for developing virtue, examining our motives before acting, reviewing our day each evening, and noting where we succeeded or failed. Practicing voluntary discomfort to train ourselves not to depend on luxury, contemplating worst-case scenarios to reduce their power to frighten us. Philosophy isn't just theory, it's practice, daily training, systematic effort to reshape our reactions and assumptions. Throughout the letters, Seneca quotes extensively from earlier philosophers, Epicurus frequently and respectfully, despite Epicureanism being a rival school to Stoicism, as well as earlier Stoic teachers and various Greek and Roman poets. He treats philosophy as a living conversation across centuries, drawing on any source that can illuminate truth, unconcerned with sectarian boundaries. His prose style is distinctive, pointed, epigrammatic, full of memorable phrases that stick in the mind. He favors short, punchy sentences over long, flowing periods. He uses vivid metaphors and concrete examples. He repeats key ideas with variations, approaching them from multiple angles, recognizing that important truths need to be heard many times before they sink in. Reading the letters now, 20 centuries later, we encounter a mind in motion, a person thinking through problems that remain remarkably current. How do we balance career and personal life? How do we resist the pressure to conform to social expectations? How do we find meaning in work that feels pointless? How do we deal with difficult people? How do we age gracefully? How do we face loss? Seneca doesn't offer simple answers, and his own life certainly doesn't model perfect solutions. But he offers something perhaps more valuable, an example of sustained effort to live thoughtfully, to examine assumptions, to keep trying to align practice with principle, even when falling short. He shows us someone who took philosophy seriously as a way of life rather than as an academic discipline, who used it as a tool for living rather than a subject for theorizing. The letters also reveal Seneca's literary artistry. They're not dry philosophical treatises, but lively, engaging pieces of writing, full of humor and pathos, argument and storytelling, abstract reasoning and concrete observation. Seneca the artist and Seneca the philosopher are one, using language not just to convey ideas, but to move readers, to change how they think and feel and act. Some letters are short, just a page or two, focusing on a single point. Others are longer, more elaborate, developing complex arguments or exploring topics in depth. The variety keeps the collection fresh, prevents it from becoming monotonous, mirrors the varied rhythms of actual correspondence between friends. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of the letters is their vulnerability. Seneca doesn't pretend to have all the answers or to have mastered all the challenges he writes about. He admits to fear, to temptation, to the difficulty of living according to his principles. This honesty makes him relatable, makes his philosophy seem achievable by ordinary people rather than reserved for saints or sages. "I'm not wise," he writes, "and I never will be. Demand from me not that I be equal to the best, but that I be better than the bad. It's enough for me to subtract something daily from my vices and to criticize my mistakes." This is philosophy as actual practice, as incremental progress, as the work of a lifetime, rather than a sudden achievement. The letters to Lucilius represent Seneca at his best, honest, thoughtful, genuinely trying to help himself and his friend live better lives. Whatever the contradictions of his actual existence, whatever the compromises of his political career, in these letters he created something of enduring value, a guide for anyone trying to navigate the gap between ideals and reality, between who we want to be and who we actually are. Seneca's death in 65 CE didn't end his influence. In many ways, it was just the beginning. His works survived, copied by scribes, collected in libraries, studied by generations of readers across centuries and continents. But his legacy, like his life, has always been marked by contradiction and debate. In the centuries immediately following his death, Seneca's reputation was mixed. Some saw him as a great philosopher and moralist, someone whose writings contained genuine wisdom worth preserving and studying. Others saw him as a hypocrite, a man who preached virtue while living in luxury, who advised clemency while serving a tyrant, who taught detachment while accumulating wealth with both hands. The early Christians had a complicated relationship with Seneca. Some early church fathers appreciated his moral teachings, which aligned in many ways with Christian ethics, the importance of virtue, the dangers of wealth and pleasure, the need to prepare for death, the value of examining one's conscience. There was even a forged correspondence between Seneca and St. Paul, created in the 4th century, suggesting these two great moral teachers of the 1st century had been in contact. But other Christians rejected Seneca as a pagan moralist whose wisdom, however impressive, was ultimately incomplete without Christian revelation. And some couldn't get past the hypocrisy, couldn't accept moral instruction from someone whose life contradicted his teachings. During the Middle Ages, Seneca's works were preserved in monasteries and studied in cathedral schools and universities. His moral essays and letters were seen as repositories of ethical wisdom compatible with Christian teaching. Medieval scholars often quoted him alongside Christian authorities, treating his insights about virtue and vice as universal truths accessible to reason even without revelation. Renaissance humanists embraced Seneca enthusiastically. His emphasis on individual moral effort, his practical ethical guidance, his eloquent Latin prose, all of these appealed to scholars trying to reconcile classical learning with Christian values. Erasmus edited his works, Montaigne quoted him extensively, and countless others found, in his writings, a model for combining philosophical reflection with engagement in public life. But the question of Seneca's hypocrisy never disappeared. How could someone who lived as he did teach as he did? Various answers emerged. Some argued that his teachings were valuable regardless of his personal failings, that philosophical truth doesn't depend on the teacher's perfection. Others claimed that he wasn't actually as wealthy or compromised as hostile sources suggested, that the contradictions were exaggerated. Still others saw the contradictions themselves as valuable, as evidence that Seneca was honestly wrestling with real problems rather than pontificating from a position of achieved wisdom. His struggle to reconcile principle with practice, his awareness of falling short, his continued effort despite repeated failure, these made him more rather than less relevant as a moral teacher. In modern times, scholarly approaches to Seneca have evolved. Historians have worked to understand him in his context, to recognize the constraints and pressures of serving in Nero's court, to appreciate the genuine dangers he faced and the limited options available to him. This doesn't excuse his compromises, but it complicates simple moral judgments. Literary scholars have focused on his writings as works of art, analyzing his rhetorical techniques, his stylistic innovations, his influence on later literature. They note how his dramatic sensibility shaped his philosophical writing, how his background in rhetoric gave his moral teaching particular force and memorability. Philosophers have debated whether Seneca was truly a Stoic or whether his modifications of strict Stoic doctrine constituted something new. He softened some of Stoicism's harsher edges, emphasized practical application over theoretical purity, incorporated insights from other schools, particularly Epicureanism. Is this corruption of Stoic orthodoxy or valuable development of the tradition? Perhaps the most interesting modern engagement with Seneca comes from those trying to practice philosophy as a way of life rather than as academic study. These readers find in Seneca's letters a practical guide, a set of exercises and reflections that can be applied to contemporary challenges. They appreciate his focus on actual problems, how to manage time, how to deal with anger, how to face loss, rather than abstract theorizing. For these readers, Seneca's contradictions are almost beside the point. What matters is whether his insights are useful, whether his exercises work, whether his approach to philosophy helps people live better. And on this practical level, Seneca's teachings have proven remarkably durable and applicable across vastly different circumstances and cultures. His influence on later writers has been profound and pervasive. Montaigne's essays owe much to Seneca's example of personal philosophical reflection. The Stoic revival in early modern Europe drew heavily on his works. Even writers who disagree with him engage with his ideas. His presence in Western moral philosophy is unavoidable. Particular works have had outsized influence. On the Shortness of Life continues to resonate with people feeling overwhelmed by busyness and distraction. On Anger offers psychological insights about managing destructive emotions. Letters from a Stoic provides an accessible entry point into Stoic philosophy for countless readers. On Providence grapples with why bad things happen to good people, a perennial human question. His influence isn't limited to philosophy and literature. His ideas about clemency influenced medieval and early modern thinking about just governance. His reflections on natural philosophy, he wrote a work called Natural Questions, exploring various scientific topics, contributed to the history of science. His dramatic works, though less celebrated than his philosophical writings, influenced Renaissance and Baroque theatre. But perhaps Seneca's most important legacy is simply his demonstration that philosophy can be lived, however imperfectly, in the midst of actual life with all its complexities and compromises. He wasn't a sage withdrawn from the world, contemplating eternal truths in pristine isolation. He was embroiled in politics and wealth, power and danger, success and failure. And through it all, he kept trying to live philosophically, kept examining himself, kept striving for wisdom. This makes him, for many readers, more accessible than more consistently virtuous philosophers. We can relate to his struggles, recognize our own contradictions in his, find encouragement in his persistence despite setbacks. If Seneca, with all his advantages and all his failures, could keep practicing philosophy, then perhaps we can too. The questions his life raises remain vital. Can you be wealthy and still be a philosopher? Can you serve unjust power while maintaining personal integrity? Is it better to compromise and retain some influence, or to remain pure and forfeit the ability to do any good? Does personal failure invalidate teaching? How much gap between principle and practice is acceptable? Different readers will answer these questions differently. Some will judge Seneca harshly, seeing his life as proof that Stoic philosophy doesn't work, that attempting to combine wisdom with worldly success inevitably corrupts the former. Others will judge him more gently, appreciating his honest effort and his genuine insights while acknowledging his failures. What seems clear is that Seneca matters, that his works continue to speak to people across vast gulfs of time and culture, that the problems he wrestled with remain our problems, that his attempts to live philosophically however imperfect, still offer something valuable. In an age of social media and public self-presentation, where hypocrisy can be exposed instantly and completely, where the gap between public persona and private reality is increasingly difficult to maintain, Seneca's example is both cautionary and consoling. Cautionary because it shows how easy it is to espouse values you don't actually live by, how moral teaching can coexist with moral failure. Consoling because it suggests that imperfect practitioners can still produce valuable wisdom, that the struggle to align principle with practice is itself meaningful, even when unsuccessful. Seneca died nearly 2,000 years ago, forced to suicide by a mad emperor, his wealth confiscated, his influence ended. The marble villas have crumbled, the estates have changed hands countless times, the gold plates have been melted down and reformed. But the words remain, copied and recopied across centuries, translated into dozens of languages, read and pondered by millions who never knew and never will know the details of his compromised life, but who find in his teaching something that helps them navigate their own complexities and contradictions. And perhaps that's legacy enough. Not perfect consistency between life and teaching, not an unblemished example of wisdom embodied, but honest wrestling with hard questions, practical guidance for imperfect people trying to live thoughtfully, and the demonstration that the philosophical life, however imperfectly lived, is worth attempting, that the examined life remains worth living, that the effort to understand how to live well persists as a meaningful human project, regardless of how often and how far we fall short of our own ideals. To truly appreciate Seneca's contribution to philosophy, we must look beyond the contradictions of his personal life and examine the actual content of his teaching. What makes Seneca distinctive among ancient philosophers is his relentless focus on practical application, on how philosophical principles can be used to navigate actual human problems. He wasn't interested in abstract metaphysics or elaborate logical systems. He wanted to know how philosophy could help someone live better today, right now, in whatever circumstances they found themselves. Central to Seneca's approach was the Stoic practice of morning and evening reflection. Each morning, he recommended, we should prepare ourselves mentally for the day ahead. What challenges might we face? What temptations might arise? How should we respond to provocations? This mental rehearsal wasn't pessimism, but preparation, training the mind to respond wisely rather than reactively. Each evening, he advocated a review of the day. Where did we act well? Where did we fail? What can we learn from our mistakes? This wasn't about guilt or self-punishment, but about continuous improvement, about using each day as a lesson for the next. When the light has been removed and my wife has become silent, Seneca wrote, I examined my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. This practice of self-examination was, for Seneca, the foundation of philosophical progress. We can't improve what we don't examine. We can't change patterns we don't recognize. The unexamined life might not be worth living, but more practically, it's a life that tends to repeat the same mistakes, to fall into the same traps, to react in the same unhelpful ways. On anger, Seneca was particularly insightful. He wrote an entire work, De Ira, exploring this emotion, its causes, its consequences and methods for managing it. Anger, he argued, is neither natural nor necessary. It's based on judgments we make, that we've been treated unjustly, that someone has wronged us, that we deserve better than we've received. But these judgments are often wrong, and even when they're accurate, anger doesn't help us respond effectively. It clouds judgment, provokes regret, damages relationships, and harms the angry person at least as much as its target. The solution isn't suppression, bottling up anger only to have it explode later, but prevention, learning to examine and correct the judgments that give rise to anger before they trigger the emotion. He offers practical techniques: delay, creating space between provocation and response; perspective, recognizing how trivial most provocations are in the grand scheme; empathy, understanding that those who wrong us are acting from ignorance or pain; and self-awareness, catching ourselves in the moment anger begins to rise and choosing a different response. On grief and loss, Seneca wrote multiple consolations: to his mother on his exile, to friends who had lost loved ones, to himself on various losses. His approach is compassionate, but firm. Grief is natural. We are not made of stone, and we shouldn't pretend not to feel pain when we lose someone we love. But excessive grief, grief that paralyzes or persists long beyond what's natural, is a choice we make, based on how we think about loss. He reminds the bereaved that death is universal, that we all die, that to have loved someone was never to own them or guarantee their continued existence. We should be grateful for the time we had, rather than resentful about the time we've lost. We should honor the dead by living well, rather than by prolonging our misery. And we should remember that those who die have simply experienced what will eventually happen to all of us. They've gone ahead, but we'll follow. These consolations can seem cold to modern readers, especially those accustomed to therapeutic approaches that emphasize working through grief over long periods. But Seneca isn't dismissing grief or demanding Stoic acceptance. He's offering tools for processing loss without being destroyed by it, for mourning genuinely without mourning permanently. On the use of time, perhaps Seneca's most passionate topic, his teaching is both inspiring and uncomfortable. We waste our lives, he argues, not because life is short, but because we squander time as if we had an infinite supply. We defer important things, invest ourselves in trivialities, please people we don't respect, accumulate things we don't need, pursue pleasures that don't satisfy. You live as if you were destined to live forever, he writes. Your own frailty never occurs to you. You don't notice how much time has already gone by. You squander time as if you drew from a full and abundant supply, though all the while that day which you bestow on some person or thing is perhaps your last. His solution is what we might call mindful living, being fully present to each activity, doing one thing at a time with full attention, distinguishing between what matters and what doesn't, investing time deliberately rather than letting it slip away in distraction and busyness. He advocates what we might now call essentialism, focusing on the few things that genuinely matter and ruthlessly eliminating the rest. This is perhaps where Seneca's own life most glaringly contradicts his teaching. He counsels simplicity while living in luxury, advocates focused attention while entangled in complex political affairs, recommends reducing commitments while accumulating vast estates requiring management. The gap between his life and his advice is, on this topic, impossible to ignore. Yet perhaps this very gap makes his teaching more rather than less valuable. Seneca knows firsthand how hard it is to live simply, how easy it is to become overcommitted, how difficult to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't. He's not speaking from achieved wisdom, but from ongoing struggle, and his insights carry the authority of hard-won experience rather than theoretical speculation. On wealth and possessions, Seneca's position is nuanced, if perhaps ultimately unconvincing. Wealth is morally neutral, he argues, neither good nor bad in itself. What matters is our relationship to it. Do we own our possessions, or do they own us? Can we lose everything tomorrow and remain unchanged in our essential self? Do we use wealth for good purposes, or does it use us? The wealthy person can practice philosophy, Seneca insists, perhaps even better than the poor person, because they face more sophisticated temptations and thus have more opportunities to practice virtue. Poverty doesn't guarantee wisdom any more than wealth precludes it. What matters is inner freedom, detachment, the ability to enjoy what you have while remaining prepared to lose it. But he also acknowledges that wealth creates complications, that having much requires much management, that possessions become burdens, that the more you have, the more you have to worry about. He admits that poverty might be simpler philosophically, even as he doesn't choose it for himself. The tension remains unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. On relationships and friendship, Seneca is warm and insightful. True friends are rare, he argues, because true friendship requires shared virtue, mutual commitment to improvement, willingness to speak and hear hard truths. Most of our relationships are superficial, based on convenience or mutual benefit, pleasant but not profound. But when we find real friendship, it's precious beyond measure. A true friend is someone who makes us better, who challenges us to live up to our principles, who loves us not despite our flaws, but in full knowledge of them, who serves as a mirror in which we can see ourselves clearly. We should cultivate such friendships carefully, invest in them generously, and value them above most other relationships. On old age and death, Seneca wrote extensively, perhaps because these topics became increasingly personal as he aged and faced multiple health crises. His approach is to demystify death, to make it familiar rather than terrifying. We should think about death regularly, he advises, not morbidly, but as a fact we'll eventually face. This contemplation makes us appreciate life more, waste time less, and fear death less. Old age, he argues, shouldn't be spent in regret for lost youth or anxiety about approaching death. Instead, it's a time for wisdom, for philosophical reflection, for passing on what we've learned. The old person who has lived well can face death calmly, having fulfilled their purpose, ready to return to the universal nature from which they came. Throughout all his teaching, Seneca emphasizes practical exercises, mental rehearsals, thought experiments, daily practices designed to train the mind and reshape habitual reactions. Philosophy isn't just theory to be understood, but training to be undertaken, a set of skills to be developed through consistent practice. This makes Seneca's philosophy deeply accessible. You don't need to master complex logical arguments or resolve abstract metaphysical questions. You just need to start practicing, examining yourself each evening, preparing yourself each morning, noticing your reactions and questioning your judgments, working on one aspect of your character at a time. His writing style supports this accessibility. He uses vivid examples, memorable phrases, concrete situations. He addresses readers directly, as friends rather than students. He admits his own struggles and failures, positions himself alongside readers rather than above them. This creates an intimacy and authenticity that makes his teaching feel personal and immediate rather than distant and theoretical. Perhaps most importantly, Seneca offers hope. Not the easy hope of quick fixes or simple solutions, but the substantial hope that comes from sustained effort. We can get better, can make progress, can become wiser and more virtuous through daily practice and patient persistence. We won't become perfect. Seneca doesn't even claim to be trying for perfection. But we can become better than we were, can subtract something from our vices, can add something to our wisdom, can move in the right direction even if we never fully arrive. This message, offered by someone who struggled with the same problems he wrote about, who fell short of his own ideals repeatedly yet kept trying, has resonated across 20 centuries. It continues to speak to anyone trusting to live thoughtfully in a complicated world, to maintain integrity in compromising circumstances, to practice virtue in the midst of vice, to keep trying despite repeated failures. In examining Seneca's life and legacy, we are confronted with a profound question that extends far beyond one Roman philosopher. Can imperfect people teach wisdom? Should we reject moral guidance from those who don't fully embody their own principles? Or does the very struggle to align practice with principle, even when that struggle fails, produce insights valuable precisely because they emerge from authentic difficulty rather than achieved perfection? Seneca forces this question because the gap between his teaching and his life is so stark and so well documented. We're not talking about minor inconsistencies or occasional lapses, but fundamental contradictions. A teacher of simplicity, living in opulence, an advocate of detachment accumulating wealth, an advisor on mercy, serving a murderous emperor, a philosopher who praised death when it was abstract and struggled when it became imminent. Yet his works have survived and remained influential for 2,000 years, read and valued by people from Augustine to Montaigne, from Erasmus to modern readers seeking practical wisdom about how to live. This persistence suggests that moral teaching and moral living, while ideally aligned, can be separated, that we can learn from teachers whose lives don't perfectly exemplify their lessons. One way to understand this is to recognize that Seneca's value lies not in claiming to have achieved wisdom, but in documenting the attempt to achieve it. He shows us what it looks like to try to live philosophically in less than ideal circumstances, to grapple with temptations and pressures, to fall and get up and try again. This is more useful, in some ways, than the example of someone who achieved wisdom easily or in favorable conditions. Consider his wealth. Yes, the contradiction between his teaching and his accumulation is glaring. But Seneca also wrote more thoughtfully about wealth than almost any other ancient philosopher. He understood its attractions intimately, the security it provides, the opportunities it creates, the social status it confers. He also understood its dangers, the anxiety it generates, the obligations it creates, the way it can become an end in itself rather than a means. His attempts to justify combining wealth with philosophy are often unconvincing, but his insights into wealth's psychological effects are sharp and valuable. He writes from experience about how possessions multiply needs rather than satisfy them, how the wealthy person fears loss more than the poor person, how accumulation becomes addictive. Someone who had never been wealthy couldn't have written about it with such understanding. Similarly, his service to Nero and his attempts to influence the emperor's behavior, while ultimately failing and morally compromising, gave him deep insights into power and its corruption. He saw firsthand how absolute power affects those who wield it, how proximity to power affects those who serve it, how the systems around emperors insulate them from reality and feedback. His essay On Clemency, written to Nero, articulates a political philosophy of merciful rule that influenced later thinking about just governance, even though Nero himself didn't embody it. The work has value independent of whether its immediate purpose, shaping Nero's character, succeeded. Seneca's failure to create a philosopher-emperor doesn't negate his insights about what philosopher-emperors should be like. This points to a broader truth. Moral teaching can be valid even when the teacher is flawed. The logic of an argument doesn't depend on the arguer's virtue. The truth of a proposition doesn't change based on who proposes it. If Seneca's advice about managing anger is psychologically sound and practically effective, it remains so regardless of whether Seneca himself always managed his anger well. But there's another dimension to this. Seneca's awareness of his own failings, his honesty about his struggles, his acknowledgement of the gap between his ideals and his reality. These create a different kind of authority. He speaks not as someone who has transcended human weakness, but as someone who understands it intimately, who wrestles with it daily, who knows how hard the philosophical life actually is. This makes him, for many readers, more credible rather than less. We're suspicious of moral teachers who claim perfection, who seem to have no struggles, who make virtue sound easy. Seneca doesn't do this. He admits difficulty, acknowledges backsliding, confesses to temptations. This vulnerability makes his teaching feel authentic, makes his successes seem achievable by ordinary people, rather than reserved for saints. His letters to Lucilius are filled with this kind of honest self-examination. He catches himself in contradictions, notes his failures, observes his own irrationality and weakness. "I'm not teaching you," he reminds Lucilius. "I'm learning alongside you." This isn't false modesty, but genuine recognition that philosophical practice is ongoing, that wisdom is a direction rather than a destination, that we're all works in progress. There's also something to be said for Seneca's persistence. Despite repeated failures to live up to his principles, despite the glaring contradictions between his teaching and his life, he kept trying. He didn't give up on philosophy, didn't decide that since he couldn't be perfectly consistent, he might as well abandon the effort entirely. He kept practicing, kept writing, kept working on himself. This persistence in the face of failure is itself a kind of wisdom, perhaps more valuable than effortless perfection would be. It shows that philosophical practice can survive and even be enriched by failure, that the goal is progress rather than perfection, that falling short doesn't invalidate the effort. Of course, there are limits to this defense. Some contradictions are too great, some failures too fundamental, some hypocrisies too damaging. If Seneca had actively opposed Stoic principles rather than imperfectly embodying them, if he had used his philosophy cynically to manipulate others while privately rejecting it, if he had caused harm that contradicted his teaching, then the gap between practice and principle might invalidate the teaching entirely. But Seneca doesn't seem to have been cynical. He seems to have genuinely believed what he taught, to have genuinely struggled to live according to it, to have genuinely wanted to be better than he was. His failures appear to be failures of weakness rather than malice, compromises with circumstances rather than rejections of principles. This doesn't excuse them, but it preserves the authenticity of his teaching. Moreover, some of Seneca's most valuable insights emerge precisely from his compromised position. He understands how easy it is to rationalize, how skilled we become at justifying our failures, how we construct elaborate explanations for why our particular circumstances make it impossible to live according to principles we claim to hold. He knows these psychological mechanisms from the inside, which makes his analysis of them particularly acute. In our own time, when public figures are regularly exposed for failing to live up to the values they espouse, when social media makes hypocrisy immediately visible and broadly disseminated, Seneca's example is instructive. It reminds us that moral authority doesn't require moral perfection, that teaching can be valuable even when the teacher falls short, that the struggle to align principle with practice is meaningful even when unsuccessful. But it also warns us about the dangers of accommodation, about how easily we can convince ourselves that our particular compromises are justified, about how philosophical principles can be bent to serve ambitions they should constrain. Seneca shows us both the value and the limits of imperfect wisdom, both the legitimacy and the dangers of teaching from a position of ongoing struggle rather than achieved success. Perhaps the final lesson of Seneca's life is simply this: none of us is perfectly consistent, none of us fully embodies our ideals, none of us closes completely the gap between who we want to be and who we are. But this doesn't make the effort worthless or the ideals meaningless. We can still strive, still practice, still work toward wisdom, even when wisdom remains incomplete. And we can learn from others who have made the same attempt, who have struggled with the same problems, who have documented their efforts honestly enough that we can benefit from both their insights and their failures. Seneca offers us this, not a perfect model to imitate, but an honest record of one person's attempt to live philosophically with all the contradictions and compromises that attempt entailed. Whether this is enough, whether we should accept wisdom from such an imperfect source, each reader must decide. But the fact that Seneca's works continue to be read, studied, and valued 20 centuries after his death suggests that many readers across many generations have found something of value in his imperfect wisdom, have seen in his struggle a reflection of their own, have learned something useful about how to live from someone who himself was still learning. The sun sets now over Rome, much as it did in Seneca's time. The same quality of light, the same arc across the sky, the same indifference to human affairs. The city itself has changed beyond anything Seneca could have imagined. The forums where he walked are ruins, carefully preserved for tourists. The palaces where he advised emperors are archaeological sites. The Tiber still flows, but between different banks, past different buildings, carrying different refuse to a different sea. Yet Seneca's voice remains, preserved in manuscripts copied across centuries, translated into dozens of languages, available now not just in libraries, but on digital devices that would seem like magic to their author. The words he wrote by lamplight in stolen hours between political obligations, in exile on Corsica, in the final years before Nero's paranoia turned fatal. These words are still read, still pondered, still capable of changing how people think and live. What is it about Seneca that persists? Not his political achievements. His guidance of Nero is remembered mainly as a tragic failure. Not his wealth. It was confiscated after his death and has long since dispersed into other hands. Not his social status. The hierarchies of imperial Rome are gone, the titles meaningless, the connections irrelevant. What persists is his attempt to understand how to live well, how to face the universal human challenges of mortality and meaning, loss and limitation, desire and disappointment. These challenges remain constant even as circumstances change radically. We no longer face Nero's tyranny, but we face our own corrupt systems and compromising choices. We no longer accumulate Roman villas, but we struggle with our own relationships to wealth and possessions. We no longer fear exile to Corsica, but we experience our own reversals of fortune and periods of isolation. And Seneca speaks to these contemporary struggles not because he successfully solved them, but because he grappled with them honestly, documenting his efforts and insights with remarkable clarity and literary skill. His letters and essays feel contemporary, not despite their age, but because of their focus on timeless aspects of the human condition. His teaching about time management resonates in an age of constant distraction and overwhelming busyness. His insights into anger and emotional regulation speak to anyone struggling with destructive reactions. His reflections on mortality comfort those facing loss or contemplating their own death. His attempts to reconcile principle with practice mirror our own struggles to live according to our values in complex, compromising circumstances. The contradictions that mark his life have become, paradoxically, part of his appeal. We see in him not an unreachable ideal, but a fellow struggler, someone who wanted to be better than he was, who had insights he couldn't fully embody, who kept trying despite repeated failures. This makes him accessible in a way that perfectly consistent sages are not. In the 21st century, Seneca's Stoicism has experienced a remarkable revival. Books, podcasts, and online communities explore Stoic philosophy, often using Seneca as a primary source. Modern readers find his practical focus, his emphasis on what we can control, his techniques for managing emotions and perceptions, surprisingly applicable to contemporary life. Business people read him for insights into leadership and resilience. Therapists find in his work anticipations of cognitive behavioral therapy. Athletes use his mental training techniques. People facing illness or grief turn to his consolations. His relevance spans contexts he could never have imagined, speaking to problems he never knew existed in forms he couldn't have conceived. But the revival also raises questions. Can Stoic philosophy, developed in the context of Roman imperial society, be cleanly extracted and applied to modern democracies? Does focusing on individual mental management risk ignoring systemic injustices? Can we separate Seneca's wisdom from the compromised circumstances in which he applied it. These are good questions, necessary questions. Seneca shouldn't be accepted uncritically any more than he should be dismissed entirely. His insights need to be tested, adapted, sometimes rejected or modified for contemporary circumstances. The fact that he struggled with wealth and power doesn't tell us exactly how to handle our own economic and political situations, but it can inform our thinking about them. What seems most valuable in Seneca is not any specific prescription, but his general approach, the commitment to self-examination, the practice of questioning automatic reactions, the work of distinguishing between what we control and what we don't, the effort to align our lives with our values, even when that alignment is imperfect and incomplete. His literary legacy is also significant. He helped establish the personal essay as a literary form, the philosophical letter as a way of exploring ideas through intimate address. His influence on later writers, Montaigne, Bacon, countless others, shaped how Western literature approaches moral and philosophical questions. His prose style, pointed, memorable, quotable, demonstrated how philosophy could be both intellectually serious and literarily artful. The various editions of his works sitting in libraries and bookstores today, from scholarly volumes with extensive commentary to popular editions marketed for self-improvement, testify to his continued relevance and adaptability. Each generation finds something slightly different in Seneca, emphasizes different aspects, applies his insights to different problems. This malleability is part of his strength. His core insights are flexible enough to speak to varied circumstances while remaining recognizably his own. Perhaps Seneca would be amused by his own persistence, by the fact that his private letters and philosophical exercises have outlasted the empire he served, that his words are read by people in cultures and contexts he never imagined, that his attempt to live philosophically, however imperfectly, continues to inspire similar attempts 2 millennia later. Or perhaps he would find it fitting. He wrote often about how we're part of something larger than ourselves, how our individual lives contribute to a human project that extends across generations, how what we learn and transmit becomes part of the inheritance we leave to those who come after. In this sense, his persistent influence is exactly what he hoped philosophy could achieve. Not personal immortality, which he dismissed as ultimately meaningless, but the transmission of wisdom across time, each generation learning from the last and teaching the next. As darkness falls across the modern world, as it has fallen every night since Seneca's time, we can reflect on what his life and work offer. Not perfect answers or unblemished examples, not flawless consistency or achieved wisdom, but something perhaps more valuable. Honest engagement with hard questions, practical tools for daily living, recognition that the philosophical life is difficult but worthwhile, and company in the struggle to live thoughtfully in a world that doesn't make it easy. Seneca died by his own hand in a bathtub, blood slowly draining from opened veins, attempting to demonstrate at the end what he had taught throughout his life, that the wise person faces death calmly, that external circumstances don't determine internal peace, that philosophy can sustain us through even the hardest trials. Whether he succeeded, whether his death was as composed as the accounts suggest, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that his words survived his death, that his attempt to live philosophically, however imperfect, continues to inspire and instruct, that the questions he asked remain our questions, that his insights still illuminate, that his example, both his successes and his failures, still teaches. The river of his influence flows on, sometimes underground, sometimes visible, sometimes broad, and sometimes narrow, but never completely dry. New readers discover him, find something that speaks to them, apply his insights to their own lives. The conversation he joined 20 centuries ago continues, enriched by each new voice, each new application, each new struggle to close the gap between ideals and reality. Rest well, knowing that the effort to live philosophically matters even when imperfect, that the attempt to understand how to live well remains meaningful even when unsuccessful, that the struggle to align our practice with our principles is itself valuable even when that alignment remains incomplete. This was Seneca's message, offered not from achieved perfection, but from ongoing effort, not from the position of one who had arrived, but from one who was still traveling, still seeking, still trying to become better than he was. The story ends here, but the philosophy continues in every examination of conscience, in every effort to manage destructive emotions, in every attempt to use time wisely, in every practice of accepting what we cannot change and working to change what we can. And in that continuation, in that endless human project of trying to live well, Seneca's voice still speaks, offering not solutions, but companionship, not perfection, but persistence, not easy answers, but honest questions, and the courage to keep asking them, regardless of how difficult the answers prove to be.